So this is our first ever annual reflection and analysis workshop, and I'm really excited to be here with over 70 other stakeholders from across the region, all different kind of partners, from small implementing partners to big crop regional agencies, who are all pulling together to try and figure out what have we achieved over the last 2 years, what's working well, what's not working so well, and to kind of think about what we might like to do differently in the immediate term. So next year, what would we like to do differently? How should we work together better to advance the outcomes of Pacific Women Lead? We are being really transparent. So all of us who are working on this, SPC, the Enabling Services team and others who have responsibility for gathering information on the program, we're doing that and we're presenting it back to our stakeholders. So we're doing it in a transparent way, and people are having the opportunity to critique, to unpack, and to tell us what they think. So it's about data transparency as well for us this week.
The rating around promoting women's voice was less than expected to expected. There's been a lot of focus and attention on numbers in Parliament and numbers on statutory boards. It's really been about a numbers game. But the stories about Pacific women's informal leadership roles, which we all know in our communities is 90% of the leadership roles are taken up by our women, whether it's at church, in the village space, at home, in all the spaces that she's in. So it's really important that moving forward with promoting women's voice, that we capture those stories.
Around the work of feminists and civil societies across the Pacific, the program Pacific Women Lead has been tracking as expected. We have identified a set of recommendations, the first being the need to increase funding for feminist leadership in the North Pacific, increase funding for women in diverse settings such as sports, and the third one is to increase funding for working with boys and men as allies.
In terms of leadership and disability, from the workshop, we rated the progress as expected to slightly less than expected. We decided that the first recommendation was to support capacity building with organizations of people with disabilities. The second recommendation was to ensure data disaggregation using the Washington short set of questions. And the third recommendation is to provide guidance and advice to partners to support planning and implementation in a disability inclusive way.
The pillars on women's safety is tracking as expected. But you know, we can do more better. We came up with 3 recommendations. The first one is to provide support to crisis centers, a multi-year funding support. The second one is to support working with male advocacy program. And the third one is to provide support to crisis centers doing work in remote areas.
The pillar on women's health is tracking as expected. There are key recommendations in terms of strengthening the work around integration of programs and services around adolescents and access to sexual reproductive health and services. There's also a need to engage cultural leaders, traditional leaders, as well as faith-based leaders in order to highlight the work around sexual reproductive health and rights. And the last recommendation, focusing on strengthening data collection, as well as highlighting the need for more impact stories around sexual reproductive health, rights, and services.
So the stakeholders in the room rated women's economic empowerment progressing as expected. There were 3 recommendations for women's economic empowerment. The first one was a guideline on women's economic advancement and women's economic empowerment, really looking at the holistic approach of how this impacts women, their families, their communities, and what that looks like. The second one is really enabling the convening of spaces to discuss best practices for women's economic empowerment initiatives. The third one is enabling better linkages with government in regards to support and coordination.
Women's rights realized and disability was rated less than expected. There were 3 recommendations. The first one was to report beyond the preconditions to inclusion. The second recommendation was for governments and OPDs to come together and strategize on disability inclusive development. And the last recommendation was for support to be provided for the implementation of disability policies at the national level.
The interventions made from the stakeholders on what they thought about this particular outcome really speaks to the need to bring greater visibility to our regional architecture for gender equality. A lot of the stakeholders have been doing great work in this space, but there is definitely a disconnect between what they're doing and their understanding of the broader regional architecture. And this, I feel, is something that's so important for the entire Pacific Women Lead microcosm to understand, that we're working under a regional architecture, that we have regional commitments that have been made over the years in relation to gender equality, and it fits perfectly well under that architecture. Two of the recommendations that I believe is key to start working on intently from next year is to bring up the visibility of the board, the governing board for Pacific Women Lead, for example, and its role in relation to the delivery of gender equality efforts under the Pacific Women Lead program. The second one, as I mentioned earlier, is to really socialize further the gender equality architecture at regional level to our stakeholders in the room who work at national level, and of course to our member governments as well.
I've enjoyed this methodology because it's given us a chance to collectively reflect on all the results and achievements of the program, but also as a space for mutual accountability and to think about how we can do things better together. This has also been very helpful for me to think about how I can use this methodology and the transformative agenda with our partners to use it as a way to drive forward our collective reflections and results.
I really enjoyed this workshop. It was a really great eye-opener for me as a citizen of the RMI, the North Pacific. I really would have loved to see and for us to be more inclusive and, to be more included in these fundings and opportunities for us in the North Pacific.
Having attended the annual reflection and analysis workshop for the program has been an amazing experience, not only to see the work and the progress the program has made within these 2 years, but also learn and really capture the gaps that lies within the work of the program. It's very, very sad to see that I was the only young person in the room, and there's great need to engage our young people more, especially acknowledging the important work that the Pacific Girl program is doing.
It's really opened my understanding as to what has worked, what needs improvement, what the gaps are, and what my role as a board member can do on the board to address those issues where decisions are made.